The morning air at the airport was sharp with excitement and noise. People rushing with luggage, the scent of coffee and perfume blending in the air, the constant announcements echoing through the terminal. Emily Parker, a woman in her early 50s with kind blue eyes and soft lines around them, stood by the window, clutching her boarding pass tightly. Her heart was racing, though she wouldn't admit it. She hadn't traveled in years. Not since her husband passed away 5 years ago. For most of her life, Emily had been the reliable one, the mother, the helper, the friend who listened but rarely talked about herself. She had promised her late husband she'd see the world one day, but she never found the courage. This trip to Rome was her first big step toward that promise. She was proud but nervous, trying to quiet the voice inside that whispered, "You're doing this alone." She found a seat near the gate and tried to distract herself by flipping through a magazine. That's when she heard a familiar voice behind her, Emily Parker. "Is that really you?" She turned, surprised, and broke into a smile. Ethan Cooper. Standing there was Ethan, her best friend, Laura's son. She hadn't seen him in years, not since he graduated college. The tall, confident young man standing in front of her looked nothing like the shy teenager she remembered helping with school essays. He wore a fitted jacket, his hair was a little messy, and his eyes carried the easy calm of someone who'd grown into himself. "I can't believe it," Emily said with a laugh. "What are you doing here?" "I'm heading to Rome for a marketing conference," he said, smiling warmly. "You? Vacation, finally." They both laughed at the coincidence. It felt good, familiar, but unexpected. He insisted on helping her with her carry-on, brushing off her polite refusals. "You always looked out for me when I was a kid," he said lightly. "Consider it payback." As they boarded, fate decided to play its quiet trick. They were seated side by side. Emily found it funny, almost comforting. It felt as if the universe wanted her to have company on this flight. Maybe even to remind her that she wasn't as alone as she thought. Once the plane lifted off, she glanced out the window, the clouds glowing pink in the sunrise. "I never get used to that," she murmured. Ethan smiled. "It's magic, ISNT. Their conversation began easily, drifting from small talk to laughter to memories of his mother. Laura, he shared how hectic his job had become, how living in the city sometimes felt lonely despite the constant noise. Emily listened quietly, her nurturing instincts waking up again. She always liked the way Ethan spoke, direct but thoughtful. The kind of person who didn't rush through words as hours passed. The plane settled into that late flight comm lights dimmed. Passengers sleeping, only the steady hum of engines filling the silence. Ethan leaned slightly toward her. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course," she said, surprised by his sudden seriousness. "I used to have the biggest crush on you," he said with a quiet laugh. "When I was like 15, Emily blinked, stunned, then chuckled softly. "Oh, Ethan, that's sweet and completely unexpected." He grinned. "I know. Don't worry, I've grown up since then. But you were always so kind. You treated me like I mattered when most adults didn't." Her smile softened. "I just tried to be kind." "You were a good kid, still trying to be," he said, his voice softer now. That line lingered between them. It wasn't flirtation, not really. It was sincerity wrapped in memory. For Emily, it sparked something gentle but powerful. It had been a long time since someone had looked at her like she was interesting. Most people now saw her as the widow or Laura's friend. But Ethan looked at her like a person, someone alive, with stories, laughter, and feelings still inside. When mild turbulence rocked the plane, Emily tensed, gripping the armrest. Ethan noticed instantly and placed his hand gently over hers. "Hey, it's okay," he said calmly. "Just a few bumps. Happens all the time." His tone, warm, steady, confident, somehow made her relax. She nodded, managing a shaky laugh. "I never get used to this part." He smiled. "Then I'll make sure you don't notice it." He started talking again. Funny travel stories, things from work, random jokes, anything to distract her. She laughed more than she expected to, grateful for his easy charm. Somewhere between the conversation and the hum of the engines, the tension melted away. Hours passed like minutes. They talked about life, regrets, dreams, the strange comfort of getting older and finally understanding yourself. Emily found herself opening up in a way she hadn't in years. She told him how she'd lost her husband, how for a long time she'd felt guilty for wanting happiness again, how she sometimes felt invisible now that her children were grown and her life quiet. Ethan listened, his gaze steady and compassionate. "You're not invisible, Emily," he said softly. "You're one of those people who makes the world quieter just by being in it. That's rare." The words hit her deeper than she expected. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her throat tightened. "That's very kind of you to say," she managed. He shrugged lightly, though his tone remained sincere. "It's just the truth." The plane lights dimmed completely now, signaling night. Outside, stars stretched across the endless dark sky, and the cabin was wrapped in a hush. Emily tried to rest, but her mind wouldn't stop replaying their conversation. It wasn't that Ethan had said anything inappropriate. He hadn't. But there was something tender in the way he looked at her. Something that made her feel seen again in a way she hadn't realized she'd been missing at one point. Ethan shifted in his seat and whispered, "Still awake?" She smiled faintly. "Yeah, you too." "Can't sleep," he admitted. "Too many thoughts." "Same," she said softly. They sat there for a long moment, side by side in silence. The world outside was endless, but in that small pocket of stillness, it felt like only the two of them existed. He glanced at her again, his voice quiet. "You know, sometimes the best things in life happen when you stop planning." She met his gaze. "That's true. Maybe that's what this trip is. My attempt at not planning everything for once." He smiled. "Then you're doing it right already." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "I'll take your word for it." Finally, her eyes grew heavy, and she drifted off. When she woke hours later, sunlight was pouring through the window. The announcement for landing echoed through the cabin. She blinked and turned to find Ethan already awake, watching the sunrise with an expression of calm contentment. "Morning," he said, smiling. "You slept through the last round of turbulence. Progress." She laughed softly. "Maybe because I felt safe this time." The words slipped out before she could think. Ethan's smile deepened slightly. But he didn't respond. He didn't need to. When the plane touched down in Rome, Emily's heart fluttered again, part excitement, part something she couldn't quite name. Ethan helped her with her luggage, his hand brushing hers briefly. The warmth of that small touch lingered far longer than it should have. At the terminal, they paused before parting ways. "I guess this is goodbye for now," Emily said. "Maybe not for long," Ethan replied. His smile easy but his tone meaningful. "We're both in the same city, after all." She smiled back. "Maybe we'll cross paths again." He nodded. "I'd like that." As she walked toward the taxi stand, Emily felt a strange mix of confusion and wonder. It wasn't love. She knew that. But it was something she hadn't felt in years. It's possibility. She climbed into a cab and looked out at the city unfolding before her. The ancient buildings, the sound of street music, the sunlight hitting stone, it all felt like a beginning. Maybe this trip would show her something about life she'd forgotten. Maybe, she thought as the car pulled away, sometimes the most unexpected people remind you who you are again. And as she turned to glance one last time at the airport entrance, she saw Ethan standing by the glass doors, watching her go, smiling faintly, as if he knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The morning sun over Rome painted everything gold. Narrow streets, cobblestones glistening after an early drizzle, and cafe tables already filled with people sipping espresso. Emily stood outside her small hotel, suitcase at her side, breathing in the scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee. For the first time in years, she felt free. No deadlines, no responsibilities, just her, a new city, and a quiet promise to herself that she would live again. But fate, as always, had its own plans. As she checked in and made her way through the lobby, she caught a familiar voice behind her. "Emily Parker, are we just destined to keep running into each other?" She turned, startled but smiling. "Ethan, you again?" There he was, dressed casually in a navy shirt, looking as relaxed as she'd ever seen him. "Guess we're staying at the same hotel," he said, holding up his room card with a grin. She laughed, shaking her head. "Rome's a big city, Ethan. This is too much of a coincidence." "Or maybe not," he replied icily. "Maybe the universe wanted to make sure you had company." It was strange. Just yesterday they were strangers again, separated by years and circumstance. Now here they were, sharing the same hotel, the same breakfast buffet, the same unexpected connection that seemed to follow them like a quiet melody. Later that morning, they ended up at the same cafe. Ethan, having spotted her across the street, waved her over. "You can't have your first Italian breakfast alone," he said. "That's a crime." She joined him reluctantly at first, but as the waiter brought cappuccinos and warm croissants, the conversation flowed effortlessly again. He talked about his work conference, the projects he was leading, and how life in New York felt like an endless loop of meetings and takeout dinners. Emily shared stories about her late husband, not in sadness, but in quiet reflection, and about how she'd spent most of her adult life taking care of everyone else. "You sound like someone who forgot how to take care of herself," Ethan said softly. She looked at him for a moment, realizing how true that was. "Maybe," she admitted, "but I'm trying to change that now." He smiled. "Good. You deserve to." There was no flirting in his tone, just warmth, genuine and calm. But that warmth was disarming. It reminded Emily of a time when connection was simple, before loss had made her cautious. After breakfast, they walked through the narrow streets of Trastevere, the heart of Rome's charm. Children played soccer in small alleys. Street musicians filled the air with old Italian songs, and the scent of basil and garlic drifted from open kitchens. Emily felt light again. Laughing at Ethan's dry humor and the way he mispronounced Italian phrases with exaggerated confidence. At one point, he stopped at a small shop window displaying handmade jewelry. "You should get something," he said. "Something that marks this trip." She hesitated. "Oh, I don't really need anything." He picked up a delicate silver bracelet and turned to her. "It's not about need. It's about remembering that you did something for yourself." His words lingered. She took the bracelet gently and smiled. "Then maybe I will." We spent the rest of the day exploring, visiting the Colosseum, tossing a coin into the Trevi Fountain, and sharing pizza at a small restaurant tucked between ivy-covered walls. It was the kind of day that filled the heart without effort. But later that evening, as the sky darkened and streetlights began to glow, Emily found herself growing thoughtful. As they walked back to the hotel, she finally asked Ethan, "Don't you find it strange? Us running into each other twice, spending the whole day together?" He shrugged lightly, his tone calm but his eyes serious. "Maybe, but I'm not complaining." "Are you?" "No," she admitted quietly. "Just ... surprised." They paused at the steps leading to the hotel entrance. The soft hum of Rome's nightlife surrounded them. Scooters passing by, laughter from nearby bars, the distant sound of a violin playing in the street. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan said, I was nervous about this trip. But running into you, it feels like it was supposed to happen." His voice wasn't romantic. It was sincere, thoughtful. Still, Emily felt a twinge of emotion. For years, she had lived quietly, her world shrinking to routines and memories. But here was this young man, her best friend's son, reminding her what it felt like to be seen, to be appreciated not for what she did, but for who she was. They said goodnight. But sleep didn't come easily for Emily. Lying in bed, she kept replaying their day. The laughter, the ease, the comfort. It had been years since she'd felt so alive. She wasn't sure what this connection was, only that it was real and unexpected. The next morning, she went down to breakfast early, hoping to gather her thoughts. She was sipping her coffee when Ethan appeared, tray in hand. "You're up early," he said, smiling. "I couldn't sleep much," she admitted. "Jet lag or something on your mind?" "Maybe both." He sat down across from her, studying her for a moment. I used to think adults always had life figured out. But the older I get, the more I realize no one really does. We're all just figuring it out as we go. Emily smiled faintly. That's the secret they don't tell you. Even in your 50s, you're still figuring things out. Then maybe that's a good thing, he said. Means we still have time to change things. After breakfast, Ethan invited her to join him for a short trip to Tivoli, a small town outside Rome famous for its gardens and waterfalls. She hesitated. Part of her thought it was better to create some distance, but his enthusiasm was contagious. Come on, said, smiling. It'll be fun. Besides, I owe you one proper tour after dragging you through every pizza shop yesterday. She laughed. Fine, but you're buying lunch. The train ride to Tivoli was quiet and scenic. Rolling hills, olive groves, and sunlight streaming through the window. Ethan sat beside her, occasionally pointing out sights. But mostly they just enjoyed the peaceful silence. When they reached the gardens, Emily was mesmerized. The fountains sparkled under the sun, and flowers in every shade of color framed the old stone paths. It felt timeless. She stopped by one of the terraces, looking over the valley. It's beautiful, she whispered. Ethan nodded. It really is. But when she turned, she found him watching her, not the view. His expression wasn't romantic. It was something gentler, almost reverent. She looked away quickly, pretending not to notice. They spent hours walking, talking about dreams and regrets. Emily spoke about her children, how proud she was, but also how strange it felt to be needed less. Ethan admitted he sometimes felt lost despite his success. That life in the city often felt shallow. I think that's why I like being here, he said. Everything feels slower, real. Emily nodded. That's what I needed too. To remember what real feels like. By the time they returned to Rome, the sun was setting, and the city glowed in soft amber light. They walked through the quiet streets back to the hotel, both tired but content. At the entrance, Ethan stopped. Hey, Emily, he said. Thanks for today. It was ... good, better than I expected. She smiled. You make it sound like you expected me to be bad company. He laughed. No, I just didn't expect to enjoy myself this much. He said goodnight. But as Emily walked to her room, she realized something had shifted. This wasn't about romance. Not yet. Maybe not ever. It was about two people at different points in life finding connection, comfort, and something neither of them had expected. Peace as she closed her door. Emily leaned against it for a moment, smiling to herself. The world suddenly felt wide again, full of color and warmth. Maybe this was what her husband had meant when he told her to keep living. Maybe it wasn't about moving on. Maybe it was about moving forward, and though she didn't know what the next few days in Rome would bring. One thing was certain. This unexpected reunion had already changed something deep inside her. Some connections, she thought, aren't accidents. They're quiet reminders that life still has surprises, and that sometimes the people who show up unexpectedly are the ones who remind you how much you're still capable of feeling. The final morning in Rome came quietly, wrapped in soft sunlight and the hum of the city waking up. Emily stood by the window of her hotel room, watching people walk below with their coffee cups and morning pastries. The week had gone by faster than she expected, a blur of laughter, small adventures, and conversations that made her feel alive again. But now her suitcase was packed and her flight was only a few hours away. As she zipped her bag, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Ethan standing there, holding 2 cups of cappuccino. I figured I'd better get in one last Italian breakfast before we go, he said with a grin. She smiled. You always seem to know exactly what I need. Lucky guess, he said, handing her the cup. They sat by the window, sipping their coffee in comfortable silence. There was something unspoken between them, the awareness that this chapter was ending, that the easy connection they'd shared might fade once they returned to their separate lives. Emily wanted to say something meaningful, something that captured how much the trip had meant. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she said softly, "Thank you, Ethan, for ... everything. I didn't realize how much I needed this trip until now." He looked at her, his eyes warm. "I should be the one thanking you. You reminded me that slowing down doesn't mean standing still. She smiled faintly. You sound like someone who finally learned how to breathe. Maybe I did, he said quietly. Later at the airport, they ended up in the same check-in line, another coincidence that made them laugh. Looks like the universe isn't done with us yet, Ethan said. Shaking his head, I guess not, she replied with a smile. When they reached the gate, they realized they were on the same flight to New York. Now that's impossible, Emily said, laughing in disbelief. Or destiny, Ethan teased. Maybe it's making sure you don't forget me too fast. Emily rolled her eyes, but she couldn't hide her smile. On board, they found themselves seated just 2 rows apart. The plane took off, the city shrinking below them, golden and distant. Emily leaned her head against the window, lost in thought. The trip had been healing more than she'd ever expected. But now that she was heading home, she wondered what it all meant. Was this simply a beautiful coincidence, or something meant to change her perspective on life? A few hours later, turbulence shook the plane gently. The seatbelt sign flicked on, and Ethan stood up from his seat, walking over. Hey, you okay? She nodded, smiling. Just fine. You don't have to check on me. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. I know, but I wanted to. Something in his tone made her heart skip. Not because it was romantic, but because it was sincere. For years, she'd been the one looking after everyone else. It was strange and comforting to have someone looking after her for a change. When the turbulence settled, Ethan took the seat beside her. They talked quietly as the passengers around them dozed or watched movies. He told her about his life, how he'd grown up feeling like he was constantly chasing expectations, how he'd never really felt at home anywhere. She shared her fears about growing older, about learning to be on her own after years of being half of a pair. You make it sound like it's too late for new beginnings, he said. She sighed. It's not too late. But it's ... different. You start seeing time in a new way. He nodded. Then maybe that's why meeting people like you matters. You remind the rest of us that time only limits you if you let it. His words touched her. They weren't meant as flattery. They came from a place of genuine respect. And that, more than anything, warmed her heart. As hours passed, the plane dimmed and the cabin lights softened. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly. Emily dozed off, her head tilting slightly. Ethan noticed and gently adjusted her blanket, making sure she was comfortable. For a moment, he just looked at her, this woman who had come into his life unexpectedly, who spoke with the kind of honesty that was rare when she woke up later. She found him still sitting beside her, earbuds in, reading. You didn't move back to your seat? She asked. He smiled. Didn't feel like it. You make good company even when you're asleep. She laughed softly. I'll take that as a compliment. Hours later, as the flight neared New York, the pilot announced their descent. Emily looked out the window, seeing the city lights twinkle below. A strange mix of excitement and sadness filled her chest. Rome had given her something she hadn't realized she was missing: connection, hope, and the reminder that life still held surprises. When they landed, Ethan helped her with her bag. So, this is goodbye, he asked as they walked toward customs. I suppose it is, she said. But I have a feeling we'll cross paths again. He smiled. I'll hold you to that. As they waited in line, she caught herself studying him, the easy confidence, the warmth in his eyes. He wasn't the same boy she remembered from years ago, visiting her house with his mother. He was a man now, kind, thoughtful, a little lost, but trying. And maybe that was why she felt drawn to him in a way that was new yet familiar. When they finally reached the exit, their paths split. Her car was waiting to take her home. His was heading toward the city. For a moment, neither moved. Emily, he said softly, thank you for reminding me that it's okay to slow down and actually live. And thank you, she replied, for reminding me that I still can. He smiled, and for a moment it felt like time stopped, not in a romantic way, but in a deeply human one. Two souls different in years, but connected by something beyond words. She watched as he walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and felt a bittersweet ache in her chest. Then she took a deep breath, lifted her suitcase, and stepped into the cool New York air. The world felt bigger now, brighter somehow. The next few weeks passed quietly. Emily returned to her routine, her morning walks, her book club, the occasional visit from her grown children. But something inside her had changed. She smiled more, laughed more. She found herself painting again, something she hadn't done since her husband passed. Life didn't feel like a series of endings anymore. It felt like a beginning she hadn't expected. One afternoon, as she watered her plants by the window, her phone buzzed. A text, Ethan. Guess who just saw a cafe that looked exactly like the one in Rome? Coffee? Sometime? She stared at the message for a moment, her heart lifting. Then she smiled and typed back, only if you bring the cappuccino this time. That small exchange, simple, warm, familiar, was enough to tell her that what they had wasn't over. It wasn't a love story in the traditional sense. It was something subtler, deeper, two lives crossing at just the right time to remind each other that connection doesn't have an age. And that healing can come from the most unexpected places. Months later, when they did meet again in New York, it wasn't with the nervousness of strangers or the intensity of romance. It was calm, genuine, a friendship rooted in respect and quiet understanding. They talked for hours again, laughing about Rome, about getting lost in Tivoli, and about how life had continued to surprise them both. Emily realized then that this was what happiness looked like now, not the grand gestures or dramatic moments, but the quiet companionship of someone who truly saw her dot as they walked through Central Park. The city alive around them, Ethan looked at her and said, that flight really did show me a side of life I'd never seen before. She smiled, her eyes soft. Me too, Ethan. Me too. They didn't need to say anything more. Some stories didn't need endings, only new chapters. And as the leaves rustled above them and the late afternoon sun cast everything in gold, Emily knew this chapter of her life, unexpected, tender, and full of second chances, was exactly where she was meant to be.